All right. South by Southwest, day two and a half, I guess, if you count the landing. This is the first video, first day session of the day, which was called Exploring the Future of Psychedelic Travel. This is Jack Yates. I am a Master's of Science and Marketing graduate student at DU. This was a great event. It was at the JW. The trend, of course, was psychedelics, but the format was interesting. It was a fireside chat session, and it was hosted by two individuals named Eva McGarry and Michaela Trimble. Eva was a sort of a PR kind of person, and Michaela was a traditional sort of written journalist. And they were talking, when they say travel, I should probably start by defining the session a little bit. They don't mean in some sort of meta, tripping, psychedelic sense. They mean that people that are literally getting on planes to fly to places like South America, Mexico, or even Oregon apparently does this in the United States, which I didn't know, which is kind of interesting, and why people do it, and the business of it, and the future of it, and why both of them actually did it. They actually described both of their experiences taking ayahuasca, and a few other psychedelics as well. DMT, I think they spoke about. And it's interesting, Michaela actually lives in Mexico City, and she says that she has psychedelic retreats less than an hour drive around her. But getting onto the talk, Eva talked about why she did it at first, and that she got into psychedelic treatment for her own mental health because she was struggling with severe depression, and she didn't get into a lot of detail, but also severe suicidal ideation. And so she went and did a psychedelic retreat in Peru, I believe it was, with ayahuasca. And I spoke to her after the event to get more specifics, and she mentioned about how her treatments had significantly improved, that they weren't cured, but, you know, she didn't give me a number or anything like that, but she said she could notice the improvement almost immediately. Michaela, her case was a little more interesting to me because she and Eva knew each other before South by Southwest, and she went on this trip because she went to do an ayahuasca treatment, I believe also somewhere in South America. I can't remember if it was the same place or different. They were kind of non-specific about where they were doing it. But she said she wasn't struggling with anything. She had a great life, good job, good relationship, good living, good community around her. But, you know, she did it because she was curious. It was sort of like this journalistic interest that she explored. And after she did it, she totally changed her life, realized how actually unhappy she was when she didn't even realize how unhappy she was, moved to Mexico City, and made all these changes that just made her happier as a person. And it was a really interesting point because it was sort of like the two benefits of psychedelic treatment. One is more psychological and one is more physical. Eva struggling with her depression and suicide ideations, which are chemical imbalances in the brain that you can actually measure. And Michaela, who sort of discovered new things about herself that she didn't even know, which was really interesting. So I really liked how they worked together sort of as a team and as friends to sort of demonstrate the two different versions, not versions, but ways that psychedelics could be beneficial from a psychological and a medical standpoint. And they also gave out some really interesting statistics, saying that the psychedelic market, generally speaking, is estimated to be around 8.3 billion with a B, and that the wellness tourism industry by 2028 is forecasted to be at 1.2 trillion with a T, and that these two sort of industries, if you will, are sort of heading towards a vector point that they've already kind of met. Yeah, it's already it's met at this vector point, and they're growing together now in tandem with literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars on the line. And that what's happening is a lot of in these other countries, Westerners are coming in and setting up these retreats, and it's just really interesting. And they made a really interesting point by pointing out that medical tourism has always been a thing. You know, this could be stuff like people flying to Colombia to get cheap dental treatments, or people going to Turkey for hair transplants. Like, medical tourism isn't a new thing. So like the practice of going somewhere getting on a plane and flying to different countries for medical treatment has already existed, but there's this huge growing demand now for the same kind of medical tourism, but on a psychedelic level. And they mentioned some interesting stats about, as psychedelic use has gone up over the years, mental health issues have gone down. So there's like these compounding graphs that directly correlate to each other, but still that 1 in 5 Americans have a mental health disorder. And they even like pontificize that number is probably even higher. And that these psychedelics really have the power to help people. And that in the last decade, there's been a 15% decline in organized religions in the Western Hemisphere, and I think it's honestly probably even more than 15%, but that's their number. And that like people are losing this like core sense of faith, and they're having mental health issues. And that according to them, they're both great case studies in how, in 2 different ways, psychedelics can really work to treat some of these issues. And then they gave sort of a timeline of psychedelics, which I wrote it all down. I can kind of breeze through it. They started in the 60s with some press guy from the Nixon administration going to South America and doing a mushroom ceremony. Some guy called Gordon Wasson, the VP of JP Morgan, documenting his use with magic mushrooms in Mexico, which actually caused an influx of tourism to this small town that actually ended up hurting it. So on and so forth. Through the decades, they talked about Hamilton Morris and the show he had on Vice, where he literally documents himself traveling around the world, trying different psychedelic medicines and breaking down the chemistry and the psychological effects and the spiritual effects as well. It's a great show. Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. And then they sort of moved on to current events. I'm breezing through the past because it's not really worth that much going over. And they talked about how this has been so helpful for veterans in particularly, that issues like PTSD and brain injuries have been helped and if not cured by the use of psychedelics. Granted, depending on the case, their dosage has to be pretty big. They mentioned how 60 Minutes did a whole, recently, like within the past month, did a whole special, hour-long special about veterans doing psychedelics and how effective it was. And, it's hard to argue with things that help veterans. And it was just a really interesting talk because it really gets into this idea of like, this is not just some fun party recreational drug. This is a tool. This is a medical tool that's helping people. And I spoke with Eva after the presentation. We spoke a little bit about therapy and things like SSRIs and how some people, therapy can take months, if not years, to fix issues. And in her case, it never actually did fix her, I shouldn't say issues, but the things she was dealing with. And that how SSRIs don't really solve the problem in your head. They just sort of push it away. And then she goes and does one ayahuasca ceremony in Peru, and boom, the next day she's significantly better than she's been after years and years and years and years. And, sorry, apologies for the pause. I'm just reviewing my notes here because I took 100 pages on this. They gave some good tips on what it's like to find the right retreat, and I'll blaze over this again, but it's important, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. She says you got to get someone on the phone. You got to know how they operate. You got to know their medical, if they have a medic on site, how far they are from a hospital, if it's a safe space, because you don't want to just go to any willy-nilly retreat. Look them up on social media. I thought was an interesting thing. One thing they said, if they're doing showing videos of guests taking the psychedelics, then don't go to that place. And then they closed with some Alan Watts quotes, which was really good, which was basically to use these products as a way to understand the world and yourself and your place within it. And again, I'm running out of time here, but I want to emphasize the point of this talk was that these are proven medical tools. And, in the mainstream, it's still kind of haha, psychedelics, hippie, whatever. But the science is real. You can measure the changes in neural connectivity in people's brains. And Eva and Michaela are living case studies of that. So this really needs to be shared more. And the idea of travel is really important.